Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today on how to evaluate a grant under the new FASB guidance. Before we get started, there are a few housekeeping items I want to address. So just so you know, you can maximize or minimize the webinar pane during the presentation by using the red and orange arrow buttons. And during the webinar, we definitely encourage you to ask questions. In the webinar pane, you'll see there's a questions box where you can type in your questions and click submit. Our presenters will be answering those questions throughout the presentation or at the end as time allows. And I definitely want to make sure everyone has good audio settings. So today you're on your phone, make sure you select the phone call audio option. And if you're on your computer, please select the computer audio option. And if you're joining us today for CPE, just a few reminders, you need to be on your own personal computer, no smartphones, and you need to be logged on with your own unique URL. Make sure you're also logged into the online software for at least 50 consecutive minutes and actively respond to 75% of the polling questions. Today we're going to have 4 polling questions, so make sure you answer at least 3. And make sure you also complete the evaluation survey at the end of the webinar. And then just as a note, everyone will receive a link to the recording and the slide deck within the next 48 hours. And today's learning objectives are evaluate revenue recognition requirements and identify the proper actions to take, discuss how the current changes affect grants and related contributions, and analyze recent and ongoing FASB updates. And today we have Brenda, who is a senior manager with Armanino's mid-market consulting practice and has more than 20 years of experience in accounting. Brenda has served as an auditor and controller in the nonprofit industry and has extensive knowledge of nonprofit accounting and compliance requirements, including U.S. single audit requirements. We also have Dean, who, after spending 12 years as an auditor, he transitioned to chief relationship builder for the firm. He helps numerous private, public, and nonprofit companies address their tax, audit, and outsource accounting needs. And then we also have Stacy, who has more than 14 years of experience in public accounting. She specializes in serving nonprofit organizations, higher education, social services, healthcare, and religious organizations. And she has extensive experience providing single audit services. And with that, I will pass it off to them.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Marie. Very excited to be here. Very excited to have a little celebrity in our midst. If you guys saw Stacy on the cover of the Cal CPA magazine, that is her in the flesh. Very
I almost
cool.
forgot about it already. Seems like a long time ago.
Yeah, right. She is CPA celebrity. We're very happy to have both Stacy and Brenda here. Today, what we'll go through on our agenda, we'll go through some of the background, so that some of the accounting overview, the effective date and transition for this, and maybe some talk about what this could all mean for your systems. Again, you know, accountants love change, right, ladies? And in nonprofit, we've been having a lot of change lately. So maybe
it all comes at once.
Right. You know, hey, why not?
Why not?
Mm-hmm.
Why not? So
Like this weather.
yeah, right. So with that said, maybe we can, you know, focus today on just, we're going to focus on the bigger items that and the impact of them, and we'll try to make this as discussion filled as possible. So please send in your questions when you get them. With that said.
Great. All right. I'll go ahead and kick us off a little bit. So just a little bit more background. So as we mentioned today, we're talking about the new standard for nonprofits in terms of recognizing grant and contribution revenue. Just a quick recap here, the standard was issued in June of 2018, so hard to believe that was almost a year ago, about 8 months ago. So really what it's going to do is it's going to clarify the scope and accounting guidance for contributions received and contributions made. So this applies for you nonprofit organizations that are both receiving and making grants and contributions. Some of you might be private foundations or other C3 or other nonprofit organizations that are also making contributions as well. And so really, why did this standard come out? Well, really it's because there's been difficulty all along in characterizing grants and contracts in the existing FASB guidance. So there's always been an issue across nonprofit organizations and diversity in practice in the application of current GAAP. And then, you know, what's happened recently also, so you all recall that the revenue recognition standards for contracts with customers was issued a few years ago in 2014. it'll be applicable here coming up. But what that did is it kind of threw a further wrench in the whole, confusion, difficulty, diversity in terms of recording and recognizing revenue for nonprofits. Just a quick clarification here, when 606 came out, contributions were always scoped out of that guidance. They were never included. But what happened is that, stakeholders and nonprofits and those involved, started talking about the grants and contributions with respect to whether or not they're treated as exchange transactions or contributions. So, whether or not there's something reciprocal that the grantor is going to receive in the exchange, or it's truly unreciprocal, a true contribution. And so what's happened is that the Topic 606, when that was issued, it took away some limited guidance that was already in the FASB standards for recognizing exchange transactions. And one of the things that we're going to talk about a little bit further is whether or not exchange transactions under this new ASU for nonprofits are actually going to be applicable under 606. So there's a little bit of, a concern that's been raised with the issuance of 606 and how that would directly apply to nonprofit grant and contribution recognition. So kind of just wanted to talk through that history a little bit. I think it's important to set the stage, especially when we start talking about like examples and we start getting more into the meat of our content today. All right, so just to finish up here with a little bit more on the background. So there is a framework that's included in the standard, which is really great. We'll talk a little bit more about that today and show you some examples. So there's some pretty robust, guidance in the standard about how to evaluate the transactions. One of the things that we're going to see, and Brenda's going to talk about this a little bit further, but I think one of the things that we're going to see is a shift, especially for those organizations that are receiving government funding. I think we're going to see a lot more organizations that might potentially record those funds as contributions, where they may have been exchange transactions in the past. So we'll take a little bit of deeper dive into that in a few minutes. The amendments in the standard, as I mentioned, apply to all nonprofits, whether or not they're either receiving or making grants or contributions or promises to give. One item here on the bottom of this slide, the amendments don't apply to government entities that are involved in transfers of assets to business entities. So I was just looking through the attendee list this morning. I don't think any of that bullet point applies to any of you on the line, but if it does, maybe we can talk about that a little bit further and just make sure the scope and the applicability to your organization. All right, so with that said, let's get you into the first polling question.
Perfect. And the first question is, what is the primary source of your organization's funding streams? Is it contributions and grants, non-governmental, or is it government grants, or is it earned revenue streams, or is it a combination of the first two, contributions and non-governmental grants and government grants, or a combination of all three?
Yeah, so we're just trying to take a pulse here of those of you on the line, sort of just to understand, where your funding is coming from. That way, that'll help kind of tailor our discussion a little bit today too with our examples.
And remember, this is our first of 4 questions. To get your CPE, you need to get 3 out of the 4 answered. So go ahead and we'll give you guys a couple more seconds to get that in. We almost at 90%.
Yep.
Okay. And it, as we expected, it's all over the place.
Right. Yeah, I totally expected that. So yeah, it looks like the majority of you then actually have a combination of grants from probably non-governmental sources, government, and earned revenue streams. So maybe like program service revenue. So this is good.
Yeah.
It's a good representation for our discussion today. So I think you all will probably benefit from some of the examples we have discussed today too.
Awesome. Well, the first topic, exchange transaction versus the contribution. I remember reading about this in the first AICPA nonprofit guide 15 or 20 years ago. It sounds like we're going to do a deeper dive. Let's do it.
Yeah, I gave a presentation on this 10 years ago, and I said completely different things. So
Awesome, Brenda.
it's kind of
Hey, accountants love change, so let's do it.
kind of turning it on its head today. So I think one of the things, and probably the reason why you joined this webinar today, is because you heard everything's going to change. And part of the reason is because of this exchange versus contribution kind of decision tree here. So the big thing is the FASB prior to this has never really defined commensurate value. It's kind of up for you to make your argument. And it's been, and as a result, interpreted very differently depending on what kind of treatment you wanted. You could probably argue it either way in some cases. In some cases, it's more clear cut. So they've now defined what commensurate value is. And they have specifically defined also what it is not. So a benefit received by the general public as a result of a transfer of assets from a government agency is no longer going to be considered an equivalent to commensurate value received by the resource provider. So that makes it such that any government grant is no longer considered an exchange transaction. It may mean that it gets recorded when it's given, but of course, a lot of these grants are going to have conditions in them. And Stacy is going to talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. So it doesn't necessarily mean that all of these grants are going to be recorded. I think what it does mean is you need to understand what all of your grants are, and specifically what impact that's going to have on external reporting, and what your story is related to that.
Yeah, so the fallback, I think what you're saying is the fallback for like government grants, for example, is no longer just treating it as an exchange contribution, because we always used to think that like the government, wasn't in the business of sort of handing out free money. So there must be something that they're getting in
There's got to be
return.
strings.
Right. But that's exactly what Brenda's talking about, is we need to evaluate whether or not there is something that they're getting in return.
Right. So now it's not, a slam dunk. For a long time, a lot of us just said, okay, government grant, automatically exchange transaction. There's no evaluation done about, is this a multi-element, arrangement? Is it a contribution? What's the nature of that grant? So I think now that has to go back on your radar. It's a good time to be talking about this because you're probably going through your budgeting or getting ready to start your budgeting process. So thinking about, this year, the process is going to be one way when you're budgeting for your fiscal 2021. It may look a little bit different. So understanding and maybe setting aside as you go through your budgeting process this time, understanding what all the grants are that are multi-year grants that are going to go into your next budget period, I think will be an important part of that. And so just the last bullet point on here about a government agency that bestows a grant. So that they're also saying that an indirect benefit in the form of services provided to the constituents of that government. So the indirect benefit, again, is not constituting commensurate value. So they're actually ruling it out two different ways. So just in case you thought you could argue that. Probably not. And really the whole point of this standard overall is to make the nonprofit industry, and there's so many different sub-niches, but to make nonprofits overall comparable from a donor's point of view.
Right.
And so as a donor, if they could give one additional, grant or money to, organizations, being from a donor perspective, being able to compare those organizations and look at them on the same basis and know that they're treating things the same way, I think is really important.
All right, so it's just like ASU 2016-14 then. It's all about the donor transparency.
Yeah, you might notice a trend here.
And like we talked about before, consistency on whether or not you're the receiver or you're the provider of the funding.
Right.
Yeah.
And this is, it's not a coincidence that this is following on the heels of 606 and the IFRS and US GAAP kind of conformity standards, as well as leases. So it's not unexpected, I don't think, here. So the evaluation criteria for determining whether a resource provider is receiving commensurate commensurate value, these 5 things should definitely be considered. So if it's not a governmental grant, or if it is both governmental and non-governmental, you're going to now put it through this through these questions. So what is your mission? So if you're getting a donation and it's not on mission, then it might not be commensurate value. What is the intent of the institution? Was their intent to make it of commensurate value? Sometimes there are arguments also when you're thinking about different donations from different currencies or different organizations that might be abroad. Maybe their intention was to make a donation of commensurate value, but the exchange rate tanked. The intent actually means a lot here. Which party has the discretion in determining the amount of the grant? Did you ask for the money, or did they tell you how much they were going to give you? Definitely something you want to consider. The penalties to the recipient for non-performance. And this is kind of getting into right of return, or do you have any other obligation or fine that you may need to pay for non-performance? And then how much discretion you have over how the funds are used. So is it restricted funding? Is it unrestricted funding? Is it broad categories, or is it very, very specific? So a lot of these things are going to come into play.
The fourth bullet point there on the penalties for the recipient for non-performance, that one's always surprising to me, I think, a little bit, because most of my clients or, the organizations that I deal with, if they can't, like if they're getting a contribution or a grant and they can't, utilize it for what it was originally intended for, or they're behind on a project that it's supporting or something, like it's interesting because the resource providers are usually very, very helpful with them and sort of saying, okay, let's do this with it instead, so that there's no, harsh, okay, sorry, you have to give it back. Sorry to be you.
Yeah, and one of the organizations I worked at when I was a controller was we always had trouble spending our grants by the time they were due because of the seasonality and flooding in the countries that we worked in. So we were kind of at the whim of the weather as to whether or not we were going to be able to build things in time. So I think we always were able to go back to our funders and just ask, hey, can we get a 3-month extension or a 6-month extension, or can we repurpose these funds and roll it into a new one?
Yeah, it's important to understand, for your funders to understand also, what you're doing and what, roadblocks or, what could cause non-performance.
Right. And from an audit perspective, Stacy, if they're going down that path, we probably just want to document that understanding so we don't have to turn it into some kind of refundable advance or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a great point. So when you're working with, your auditors, and when you're talking internally amongst management, or even if you're doing some type of system implementation, with your consultant, it's good to walk through the process and have a chart or have some kind of documentation. We'll go through something in a little bit, but have something that just documents, your rationale and your discussions. That way there's not going to be any issue, for example, at the end of the audit, or, if you do come across a non-performance.
Right. It's in your control. So hopefully before you get to a non-performance issue, you're able to reach out to your funder and head that off. All right, some examples. So got a couple different examples here of some example cases and scenarios to help you kind of wrap your head around this. So local government provided funding to nonprofit B to perform a research study on the benefits of a longer school year. The agreement requires a nonprofit B to plan the study, perform the research, and summarize and submit to the local government. And the local government retains all rights to the study. So in this case, it should be considered an exchange transaction. And that's because the local government is retaining the rights to the study. So they are benefiting and receiving all of the benefits from you performing this research. So it includes a procurement arrangement in which commensurate values being exchanged, and they're performing the research study for the local government, and then they turn it over. So it may be in line with their mission, it may be work they're doing anyways, but in this case, it would be an exchange transaction. So it's still not always going to default to a contribution. So I think when this first came out, a lot of people were really scared that, this means everything's going to flip. Things we didn't record, we're now going to have to record. And so we wanted to share this example to really highlight that you have to go through a decision-making matrix and really evaluate it on its merits, because it depends on facts and circumstances in every case. So going through and looking at the criteria for what constitutes commensurate value.
Yeah, just thinking from a board member perspective also, or someone on your board who maybe doesn't have an accounting background or a nonprofit background. Right, this is interesting because in this scenario, if this nonprofit got the funding up front and it's an exchange transaction, then it's technically recorded as deferred revenue. And so, we get questions all the time, and I'm sure that those of you on the webinar, you get questions from your board members all the time just about the current treatment, of nonprofit revenue recognition and why it causes some of those big ebbs and flows during the year, or over the years, because, grants and awards are being recorded as restricted or unrestricted. So I think we're going to see a lot more here, if exchange transactions are going to be recorded as deferred revenue. And so, folks who maybe have seen for-profit financials or, might be used to that background, it might make it a little bit easier and, kind of more transparent to wrap their minds around, to wrap their heads around.
Yeah, and it's just a lot of things to consider. Yeah. All right, so example number 2. So Nonprofit E is a public charity that performs research on various diseases and allergies, including gluten-related, as part of its mission. So they received a grant from a foundation to perform research. So they retain the right to the research after it's done, control how it's conducted, and the results will benefit the clients that the nonprofit itself serves. So they have a monthly reporting requirement to the resource provider, and that includes an overview and analysis of the research conducted. So this standard actually doesn't change that long-standing standard that a financial obligation to provide a financial report or a summary of how you spent the grant money does not constitute a condition. So that is fully within your purview to be able to provide that, and no nonprofit is not going to provide that and risk their funding there. So in this case, Nonprofit E determines that the grant is in fact a contribution because the resource provider is not receiving anything back. So unlike in the previous case study where the government agency retains the right to the research after the fact, in this case the nonprofit retains that right to that research. And that's the determining factor in this particular set of examples, is that research is what's considered the commensurate value, and who it resides with determines whether it ends up being an exchange transaction or a contribution.
Yeah. Sounds like control.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sounds like control is the big difference between the two. Okay, yeah, because it's just like that whole, standard reporting is just not a condition.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Absolutely.
Good. At least there's some things that haven't changed.
Right.
But Brenda, you work a lot in systems implementation. Have you ever truly run across a nonprofit that's been unable to satisfy a grantor reporting requirement from their system? And how did they sort of, I'm putting Brenda on the spot, how did they get around that?
Here we go.
Well, I had that problem when I was a client, and I got around it by implementing Intact. Shameless plug. So
I was going to say Excel. That's what I was going to say.
Excel, yeah. Excel was the common reason, but it was really painful for us. On average, it took us 3 weeks to pull together all of the data needed for a funder report. So because it was coming from 5 different systems, and there's 8 different people that have input, so being able to pull all of that information. It takes a little bit of setup at the outset of the grant to set up, the specific report, with all of the grant reporting buckets that they need to have, the line items and making sure that you're controlling the budget so people can't code things to a grant where you don't have line items for it. So a lot of setup at the beginning, but then the system enforces, spending against the grant, and gives you a window into what is unspent. So once we had that window into what was unspent, it made it much easier to go to our funders and say, hey, it looks like we're not going to spend this by the end of the grant period. We need an extension or a reallocation, to a different line item, and kind of putting accounting more in the position of being a proactive partner instead of somebody that gives you a report after it's already happened and you're like, well, what am I going to do now?
Right.
Yeah.
So leveraging technology is, what you just talked about is something that we're hearing more and more nonprofits really make the move to, is leveraging technology, because nobody has the time that you're talking about.
Right. And, being able to automate, or integrate systems so you don't have any data silos allows you to spend less time on data entry, which is not a value add, I think, to an organization. It has to be done. It's required for financial reporting. But where I think the value accounting can bring is when you're being able to look forward and help people have not just data, but information to be able to make decisions on that.
Awesome, Brenda. Great.
All right, and that brings us to polling question number 2.
Awesome.
All right, if you missed the last one, you better click on this one.
So true or false, all government grants will be considered exchange transactions. Okay, we'll give everyone just a few more seconds here. Okay, and we'll go ahead and close the polls.
Awesome. Almost everybody was listening. So most government grants would be accounted for as contributions. However, there are some instances where they might be exchange transactions. And even if they're counted for as contributions, they might be conditional.
They might be.
And that brings us back to Stacy.
All right. So let's get a little bit deeper into distinguishing between conditional versus unconditional contributions. So Brenda really emphasized the first part of this standard is determining whether or not the award is an exchange transaction or a contribution. So if you identify that you have an award that is a contribution, you have to go one step further with it and determine whether or not it's conditional versus unconditional. So that's going to be, as I should advance my slide here, that's going to be the first thing that you have to do here. So essentially, if it's conditional, it's coming with some kind of strings. But under the old guidance, those strings were, as we've mentioned before, a little bit sort of loosey-goosey. But now there is going to be some more specific changes in the guidance that are going to address the diversity. So on that second bullet point, grants and similar contracts have terms that could be interpreted as conditions, i.e. the reporting item that Brenda mentioned before. That's something that nonprofits could interpret as a condition. So in the new guidance under the amendments, those terms would only create a conditional contribution if they introduced barriers that must be overcome by the recipient. So that highlighted word barriers, and we'll talk a little bit further about what that means and what some indicators of barriers could be. That is what has to be overcome by the recipient under these new standards, under these amendments. So it's no longer just saying, oh, we have to, have this reporting requirement. We don't know if we're going to fulfill it, but there's actual barriers that have to be considered now.
Okay, I want to hear more about this for sure.
So in addition to the barrier, the donor, so we'll just focus on this example, and the donor must have a right of return of assets or a right of release from its obligation for performance. So the transfer of assets for the award to be conditional. So the barrier has to exist, that's the indicator. And then they either have to have right of return or right of release.
So when they write that pledge agreement or contribution agreement, not only does it have to introduce the barrier or the challenge or the condition or whatever, but there has to be, I haven't really seen many of the right of return of asset piece before.
Right.
That sounds like new language.
Yeah, no, I haven't either. And I think this becomes especially important, Dean, as you pointed out, for organizations that are in the business of grant making. So if you're a foundation, or if your organization, under its mission is making grants out to other organizations, you really are going to have to focus on the language that's going into the award terms and the award contracts that you're drawing up for the organizations that you're providing grants to. Because all of this language that is in the standard, in the amendment, should be included in those award agreements. It shouldn't be vague. It should be very clear and very transparent.
And I think it's also important to make sure that you understand and know what treatment you want. Like,
or what's beneficial?
Right?
Yes,
what's
exactly.
beneficial to your organization?
Right.
Like, do you want this to be recorded now, or do you not want this to be recorded now? And making sure that your development team is either looping you in or understands what those criteria are when they're looking through grants and contracts, or just grants actually, to make sure that that you're getting the desired treatment that you want. Because the last thing you want to do is get this huge grant and then have the opposite treatment than what you were expecting.
Right.
And what be surprised by it, because once the grant is signed and inked and you're executing it, it is what it is.
And then you got to go back to them and try to change it.
Yeah, either amend it or make an argument.
What about, we do have a question, Stacy, and it's actually really good. It says, is conditional synonymous with restricted, or and let's kind of clarify that real quick.
That's a really, really good question. So conditional is not necessarily synonymous with restricted. So you could have, let's say that you've identified an award that truly is conditional. So the award has some type of barrier attached to it, and you've identified that there's some right of return or right of release. So once you've identified it's conditional, you still have to go through this process. If you accept the award, you still have to go through this process of satisfying and overcoming the barrier in order for that right of return or right of release to be satisfied. But that doesn't necessarily mean at that point that it doesn't have any sort of further restrictions on it, right? Because we have seen that scenario happen before. But the two are not necessarily linked to each other. Could be whenever the condition is satisfied, it could just truly be unrestricted at that point. That's a great question. Hopefully that answered your thoughts on that question. Okay, so let's take a little bit of a deeper dive here and take a look at what barriers could look like, or what form they could take, what they could mean. So as I mentioned before, barriers are indicators. So why I place emphasis on that is because you as an organization, and again, whether or not you're the resource recipient or the provider, you need to be thinking about these barriers as a guide, as sort of like an assessment tool to determine what these indicators as an assessment tool to determine whether or not there's a barrier that exists. So there could be many indicators. I mean, you could have an agreement that has several different, indicators in it that create barriers, or several barriers. That's completely possible. And there's also, I think it's fair to say, and the guidance points this out too, that there's no one indicator that trumps the other, right? You could have three different indicators in an award contract, but maybe really only one creates a barrier.
Yep.
So you really have to take the time to go through the analysis. I just want to point that out first before we take a deeper dive into this.
And also just keep in mind that grant contracts, that if they're multi-year grant contracts that you're signing now, they are going to fall under the standard. So you may want to, if you don't already have some sort of process in place with development, to have a finance review of the grant before it's signed. You may want to do that as soon as possible to make sure that you understand what those, and get the treatment that you're looking for.
Yeah, that's definitely a best practice for sure, is getting the, whether it's the CEO or the executive director, the CFO and the advancement director, all on the same page ahead of time. so that everyone is above board. A lot of times we know that the finance team gets the grant as it's already done and inked, and then they have to look at it, and then the auditor gets it, and then we say, well, did we think about this, and this? So that's definitely a best practice, is for everybody to be in constant communication. Stacy, there's one more clarification comment on restrictions versus conditions. Maybe you can give a quick example.
Yeah, so I think to answer that question, let's actually look at this performance-related barrier that's on the top row here. Perfect. On this slide that's up front, because I think this is a really good example of some transactions that you've probably have all maybe addressed or seen before. And the example is where there's some type of outcome, level of service, units, matching funds, what have you. And in this specific example, so this nonprofit is receiving funds, but it's contingent upon that nonprofit raising matching funds. So here we've got an indicator of a barrier. The barrier is something that's performance related. In this example, if that nonprofit doesn't raise the matching funds, then they're most likely not ever going to be able to recognize this award as unconditional. So this particular example is like ages old. I mean, we see this all the time.
The challenge grant, all that.
Another thing that hasn't changed.
If you're in a campaign and, the donor is saying, okay, I'm going to give you this amount, but I want you to raise,
I want the community to chip in for the rest.
Yeah. Right. You want the board, to chip in. That's a perfect example to kind of answer that question. So it's a barrier that exists under the new guidance, but it's also something that existed previously as well. And then we just had another question about denoting conditional versus unconditional and why that's important. So it's important because if you have a conditional award, then if you've received funds up front and you identify award as conditional, then you're going to have a liability on your statement of financial position for that condition. If you have a conditional award and you have not received funds up front, then you probably have a footnote disclosure, which many of you have most likely had in your financials before in some way, about those conditions and the fact that you're not recognizing the revenue on it. So that's why it's important. But when you have satisfied the condition, then you have to determine, whether or not there's any additional restrictions.
I think what you're saying, Stacy, is that conditional versus unconditional is what determines the timing of the revenue recognition.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. And so what if you meet the condition, but you don't yet have the money?
If you meet the condition, so basically it becomes unconditional and you don't have the money, then that's the trigger that you can recognize and record the revenue.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Great.
So we've got another question just about some of these other barriers here. So let's talk about the rest of the barriers that are on this slide. So you could have barriers or indicators that are related to the purpose of the agreement. So maybe there's some, funding agreement, for example, that, wants you to address a cybersecurity risk or wants you to do some type of like research study or create a system or something of a like. It's essentially like an activity or event. Those are things that are indicators of barriers that you might have to overcome. If you have a situation where let's say you're the recipient of an award and you have limited discretion on how those assets are going to be spent. So let's say the award document gives a little bit more, right and control in the resource provider to tell you, what you're going to do with those funds. Again, that's an indicator of a potential barrier because essentially the resource provider could, redirect or, redesign what they want the funding to be used for. Again, it's just another example, but it doesn't necessarily, automatically point you to a conditional a recognition of the award. Okay. All right. So let's show you a quick flow chart here. So this is something, as we were mentioning before, this is something that's very simplified, very useful that you can include in your internal processes, your internal controls. That's going to help you sort of walk through what you need to do to determine whether or not a transfer of assets is a contribution or exchange, and then whether or not, if you've identified it as a contribution, whether or not it's conditional or unconditional. So you can see there at the top that, like Brenda talked about before, your first step is identifying whether or not there's commensurate value in the transaction. If there is, most likely the transaction is considered an exchange. Nonprofit organizations that identify an exchange transaction, you'll have to follow Topic 606, and that's contracts with customers. But if not, as we've been talking about, you have to go through, if there's no, it's non-reciprocal, there's no commensurate value that's going to be received, the award is going to benefit, the clients of the organization or, the general public, then that's where you're identifying whether or not it's a conditional or unconditional contribution. And you go through the process of identifying any indicators that would point to a barrier that exists to determine conditional or unconditional. So it's a really short example of a flow chart, something that you can put into your processes and something that you can utilize when you're reading through and looking at awards, especially ones that maybe you haven't had those upfront conversations with your grantors about. Or if you're the resource provider, you haven't had an in-depth conversation with the organization that you're providing to. Mm-hmm. So something to help you. This is also in the standard for those of you that have seen the full standard. This is a snapshot of the flow chart that's in the standard, so you can always grab it out of that too if you've got that handy.
Mm-hmm. And we're so there's actually once you determine it's a contribution, you also have to determine, is it temporarily restricted, unrestricted, permanently restricted?
Or with or without restriction.
Right. And with you still need to know the three buckets because the MIFA still applies. So you still need to know what your endowments are. But I think, it's not on this because we're really just talking about the conditional or unconditional. But as Stacy was mentioning, it is a parallel but similar decision tree that we're not covering in this webinar today because it has not changed.
So we've got a couple of other questions here. The first one is whether or not, if it's believed by the nonprofit that it can deliver on the terms of the award, then is it not a barrier? So I would say in that situation, and let me just go back to this slide here. I would say in that situation, if the nonprofit, believes that it has discretion, there's not going to be any specific activity or purpose or performance related obligation that they're going to have to satisfy, then yes, I think that they can safely assume that there's no barriers or there's no indicators of barriers that exist. But you could have a situation, again, just pointing back to that top row here on this slide, you could have a situation where you know that you're going to be able to raise those matching funds, but it's still a barrier, right? It's still a barrier until you actually do it.
Right.
Well, what about something like, you're required to produce 100 units per month and you're producing 500 units per month.
Yeah, you already know.
Is that a barrier?
It's a barrier, but you're going to be able to do it.
And so you can just recognize it.
But the standard says that once the condition is met. So you could recognize that maybe in the first week of the month once you have served 100 units.
And if those 500 units that you've already produced qualify to, meet the barrier in that award, then you may be able to recognize it right away.
Yeah. So if it's patient served, meal served, whatever that unit is.
Right. Or maybe expenses that will be incurred. Right there. If you guys incur $100,000 of expenses towards X, then I'll give you $100,000, and you know that every year we incur $500,000, then I tell you you're good to go.
Yeah, and then we have another question that's asking, can you have a conditional restricted grant?
That was a good one.
Yeah, no, that's a good question, and I think that we just need to reemphasize that conditional versus unconditional is not synonymous with restricted versus unrestricted.
Yep.
Because you could still have a conditional award, the matching one, for example, but then when you match it, it has to be used for X.
Right. Like a scholarship.
Or maybe it's part of a capital campaign that you've been raising funds for renovations or improvements or, seismic retrofitting or what have you. Those could be good examples where maybe there's some type of restriction attached to it.
That actually just happened at my college. The president of the college made a grant as a challenge grant to get us to the end of the capital contribution campaign. So that's a perfect example there.
Yeah, so the restricted piece of it is sort of the restricted, or I should say restricted or without restrictions, because that's the new terminology, right? Under the
Without
new reporting model.
Without donor restrictions.
Without donor restrictions, with or without donor restrictions.
See,
So
we all love change.
We all love change.
We're all implementing it as we speak. We're living through it.
So that's the next step here. So at the bottom of this chart on the slide here, when you get to the point of whether or not you've determined it's conditional or unconditional, you may still have to ascertain whether or not it's with or without donor restrictions.
Indeed.
So
Right.
if you think about it like a tree, like we're trying to describe here, it's the next step in the process. So
Right.
exchange versus contribution, that's sort of like the top hierarchy, conditional versus unconditional. But you may still have to determine whether or not there's restrictions after that.
And I think that's a good point, because like once you get down to the bottom here, it's conditional. Hopefully at some point it will become unconditional, and then you go to the second from the bottom box and answer that question again. And then you're going over to the right, and then you're determining at that time, does it now have restrictions or not?
Right.
Yep.
Once you've recognized
Yes.
Once
the
you
revenue.
recognize.
Need to make sure it goes in the right net asset bucket.
Yeah, these are great questions.
Very good
These are
question.
detailed.
Please.
And it just
Detailed
shows you,
questions.
it just goes to show that, how much,
How many questions
ambiguity
there are,
and,
yeah.
and,
There
Yeah.
has been.
Yeah, that diversity. So in this next example, I thought we would kind of take a little twist on the example that Brenda went over earlier with the research grant. So this is the exact same example, but I've added in some wording changes. So we'll see what your thoughts are here on this one. So essentially the case study, it's the same public charity that performs, the research on the various allergies, gluten-related, et cetera, that's part of its mission. So it's receiving a $100,000 grant from the foundation to perform the research. The grant agreement here includes a right of return as part of the foundation's standard wording and requirement that a report must be filed with the foundation at the end of the period, at the end of the grant term, explaining how the assets were spent. So a little bit different language, a little bit different scenario in the case study. Curious to see what your thoughts are here. So when we took a look at this, we determined that this grant is not a conditional contribution. So the research on the gluten-free related allergy issues, that's something that definitely is narrower than the overall issue, but it's still mission of the entity, but it's still within the mission. There's no requirements here in this particular scenario that indicates any barriers. Remember, we said before that there has to be a barrier with a right of return or right to not have to fulfill the obligation. So this nonprofit in the example also determined that reporting requirement was not a barrier because it's essentially administrative in nature. There's no reason why they wouldn't be able to fulfill that. And they also said it's an example of a grant that includes, including a right of return would not be considered conditional because that return clause is not coupled with a barrier to overcome. So they've determined that this is actually not a conditional contribution, so it's unconditional.
I think that's important, that both have to be present. One on its own is not enough.
Absolutely. So let's take a look at another one. So this is a contribution to a nursing program. So in this example, an institution applied for and received a grant from a funder. It's going to be used to provide career training in the nursing program. The grant does stipulate that there's a minimum number of patients who must receive services through this program during the year before the funder will transfer the assets. So maybe there's a right of obligation here that needs to be fulfilled. The award, so the answer here is that the award is classified as a contribution because the public is benefiting from the award rather than the resource provider. Remember, we're still trying to determine whether or not it's conditional or unconditional. This agreement also includes a barrier. So there's a right of release related to a performance metric in terms of the patients who would receive services in this program. So this particular organization has indicated that this contribution would be considered conditional until those performance-related barriers are satisfied. Now, like we mentioned before, like Brenda mentioned before, if the nonprofit is satisfying those performance-related barriers as they go along, then certainly there's an excuse there for some type of allocation and recognition of that award as they're performing the services and serving the patients.
Right, and also something to think about, you know, in most nonprofits, they're not doing a lot of external reporting on a monthly or quarterly basis. So it may make sense, you know, to record it when you get the grant as, you know, as it will be at the end of the year. So you don't have to do the monthly accounting. If you know, in my 100, 500 example that it's a slam dunk, there's no way you're not going to meet that. You know, save yourself the hassle of the monthly release.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's look at one more example here in conditional versus unconditional determination. So this is a contribution from a foundation. So the foundation receives a grant proposal from an animal rescue facility, which is nonprofit A. It's requesting a 3-year grant for $1 million up front to be used to expand its operation. The agreement indicates that the nonprofit must expand its facility by at least 5,000 square feet to accommodate additional animals at the end of this 3-year grant period. And it does have a right of return if the minimum expansion target is not achieved. So this is an example of, again, where there's a conditional grant because there is a barrier regarding the additional square footage that should be achieved, that should be added on to the facilities. Otherwise, the resource provider is entitled to a right of return of those unused assets that have been unmet on the expansion requirement. So good examples of, you know, barriers and indicators and things to consider, not only when you're looking at talking to funders or, you know, potential awarding nonprofit organizations to put into the grant agreements, but also if you've received grant agreements to make sure you've got the recognition proper.
And we've had so many good questions come in that I think our very next webinar on this topic is going to be conditions versus restrictions.
Yep. It seems to be centered
Awesome.
around that. We've got the next topic.
That's our next topic. You guys will see that in probably the next 6 weeks or so.
And we've got a couple more questions we're going to answer here, but before we do that, I'm going to push you on to the next polling question
Get your
so we can
CPE.
get that answered. Yeah.
Awesome. So the question is, which of the following are examples of barriers that can indicate conditional contributions? Is it performance related, further actions needed by recipient, stipulations related to the performance of the agreement, or is it A and B? So the first two options, performance related and further actions needed by recipient, or all of the above.
And this is question 3 of 4. Everyone make sure you get your answers in. We've got 65% of the people have voted so far.
Nobody else needs CPE.
Yeah, right. Either that or that long section of conditions and restrictions.
Lots of questions.
We lost some people. No, that's good.
Awesome. And we'll go ahead and close the polls.
Yeah, so it looks like most of you said that all of the above, so the performance-related metrics, further action that might be needed, or any stipulations would all be examples of conditional contributions. So that is a good answer. All of those things should be considered. So I want to just answer one question real quick before we move on here. So someone in the audience asked a question about the nursing program example that we had and whether or not a pledge receivable would be recognized along with a liability. So in this particular example, I think we got our slide pulled back up here. So in this particular example, if the nonprofit is receiving the resources up front, and if it's going to be classified as a contribution, which I believe what we said it was classified as a contribution, if they're receiving a pledge, then they would consider receiving a pledge, recording a pledge receivable. I can't talk anymore. They would consider recording a pledge receivable and some type of liability depending upon whether or not it was conditional or unconditional. So remember, if it's something that's conditional and they're getting funding up front, then yes, they're recording the cash funding up front and a deferred, some type of deferred liability or deferred revenue for that. If it's conditional and they have not received funding up front, then that's a footnote disclosure only. But if we're talking about a truly unconditional award, then revenue recognition can happen right away. So yes, there might be a receivable that's recorded in line with the recognition of the revenue.
All right, just a few more slides here. I probably should have called this slide "Things You Should Do Now" instead of the system, because some of this stuff probably isn't in any system, or it's only in a development system at this time. So making sure that you have the ability to take an inventory of all your active grants, all your grants that you have now, they're going to be effective, and we'll talk about the effective date in just one slide here. And also, making sure that you're part of the process for things that will be effective that you don't have currently today, but you will enter into over the next year that'll spill into the next fiscal year. Making sure you understand how to determine commensurate value, whether or not something is equal, and whether or not it's an exchange transaction. And in which case, as Stacy mentioned, we've got to follow topic 606 and determine all of the elements and assign the value there. Lots of webinars on that on our website if you do find that you have lots of exchange transactions. And then the conditional versus unconditional. But I think one of the things I wanted to also point out is about controlling the narrative and understanding, the implications this is going to have beyond your organization. As I mentioned, definitely on the budgeting process, how you're going to budget for these things. Most organizations are only budgeting for unrestricted revenue, but understanding conditional, unconditional, restricted, unrestricted, and whether or not it's going to be recorded next year at all, or when you actually meet the condition, might push it out into a future year. So from a budgeting standpoint, that's important to understand. You may have single year financial statements in the year of adoption for this because there might be big changes and big swings in what your revenue is because things may have been recorded differently had you been following the standard all along. And then, of course, thinking about implication on any external reporting, such as debt covenants, if you've got any line of credit or any obligations for expansion or anything there. All right, that brings us to polling question number 4.
On the home stretch.
So the question is, how significantly do you think the standard is going to affect your annual revenue? Is it a little bit, no change, a lot, or are you still not sure?
This will be an interesting polling question. Because I think at the beginning of the webinar, if I remember the first polling question correctly, most of you said that you've got a combination of non-governmental and governmental contributions, grant agreements, and earned revenue sources. All right, so it looks like we've got most of you who have responded. Just go ahead and close the polls. Wow, so it looks like 41% of you are still not sure. So I'm guessing based on the questions that probably relates to the ongoing questions that you have about conditional versus unconditional. So definitely the top of our next webinar.
Yeah,
Indeed.
Conditions, restrictions, all that stuff.
All right, so how soon is this going to affect you? We've kind of alluded to it throughout the webinar here. It's effective the same as topic 606. So for annual periods beginning after December 15th for 2018. So if you are on a calendar year, this is already effective for you. This one went through fast. They don't always go through this fast, but this one did. And so for resource providers, so if you are a grant making organization, it's effective for annual periods beginning after December 15th, 2019. So if your calendar year, that will be next year. If your fiscal year, it'll be fiscal 2021.
And we're just about out of time, but we still have lots and lots of questions. I think what we'll do is the three of us will kind of go through the list of questions and email some folks back. And like I said, this probably will be the next topic of our next webinar as well. We'll do an even more deeper dive on some of the topics here that we've done today because, hey, we all love change.
We all have changed.
But yeah, so no, that sounds good. Is there anything else that we want to touch on real quickly?
Yeah, I would just say this last slide here on the effective date and transition has a lot of information on it. I would just say at a 10,000 foot level that it depends on your organization. It's really going to depend on how you want to implement it because there's an option for a prospective and a retrospective application in order to adopt this. So if you're looking at some type of prospective basis, you're going to have to take into account agreements that you have that are still open during the period of adoption because those agreements may fall into the scope of your implementation a little bit differently than if you're taking a retrospective method. So definitely discuss that with your auditors, with your service providers, with your granting organizations, because that's going to be a little bit different from all of you. And of course, we've had lots of clients and lots of constituents that have asked about early adoption. We've had several clients that have actually early adopted this, and so that's completely permitted. If you think that you're ready for it, and you think that your policy is already aligned to some of the things that we talked about in the standard, by all means, you can take advantage of that. Otherwise, as Brenda mentioned, the first time that you all are going to see this, if your calendar year end is 12/31/19 or June 30, 2020.
All right.
Awesome.
Awesome. Thank you everyone for joining. And just a few reminders, please make sure you fill out the survey at the end and slides will be available to you within the next 24 hours.
Thank you, everyone, for coming, and thank you for all of your questions. Definitely gave us lots of insight to think about as well.
Yeah. Have a great day.